Fellas, we're very likely to see a rematch between Alex Pereira and Magomed Ankalaev later on this year, so I'm going to build a card between the two of them. One in Brazil, one in Abu Dhabi. Two completely different cards, both headlined by Alex and Ankalaev. And we'll start off with a UFC Brazil pay-per-view card builder. Last time the UFC went to Brazil was at UFC 301, I think it was, in May of last year, so they're probably going to go this summer. Wouldn't really make much sense for Ankalaev versus Pereira to headline an event in Brazil, considering that Porto's no longer the champion. If he was the champion, then obviously this makes sense, but for Ankalaev to be defending his belt in Brazil doesn't really make sense. But if that was the headliner, the co-main event that I would do in Brazil would be Arman Tsarukyan versus Charles Oliveira. This is a fight that I think makes a lot of sense in the lightweight division. There's a lot of fights that make sense in the lightweight division, and this is one of them, I think, at this moment in stage. They're both like a fight away from a title shot. They've fought before, very close fight, both in a similar position where they can both make a case to say that they want a title shot. And when was the last time Charles Oliveira competed in Brazil? He hasn't fought in Brazil for so long. He's one of the Brazil's biggest stars right now in the UFC. I think it makes sense to give him a shot in Brazil in a co-main event, a #1 contender fight against Arman Tsarukyan, and if he wins, he gets to fight Islam Makhachev later that year. So I think Oliveira versus Tsarukyan makes a ton of sense. The UFC have already said they're not going to give Tsarukyan a title shot because he pulled out last minute. I know there's Justin Gaethje in the wings, but I say we do Topuria Makhachev, Gaethje versus somebody else, and then in the meantime, Oliveira Tsarukyan, co-main event, 5-round co-main event as well, which is why it's the co-main event, so we can actually make this one 5 rounds, because obviously the first one being 3 rounds was kind of controversial. Oliveira, Arman Tsarukyan, 5-round co-main event in Brazil, solidify the #1 contender in the lightweight division to fight Islam Makhachev, or maybe Topuria if Topuria wins. I think we get that fight done. Then the featured fight of this card should be Nassourdine Imavov versus Caio Borralho, another #1 contender fight, this time in the middleweight division. Now, we're almost likely to see Chimaev versus Dricus du Plessis at some point later this year. And I think the winner of that fight should face the winner of Imavov and Caio Borralho. They're both in a very similar position. Both, again, like I just talked about with the last two guys, a fight away from a title shot. Imavov's just knocked out Adesanya. Borralho's on this huge run and just battered Jared Cannonier. They're both in the top 5. And I think this would be such an interesting and a tough fight to pick, because Imavov's been on a roll. Borralho's been on a roll. Brazil versus, I mean, technically Imavov's French, but he's a French Dagestani, so it's kind of like that Brazil versus Russian kind of conflict that they've got going on. Another chance for Caio Borralho to fight in Brazil. Last time he fought in Brazil, he obviously knocked out Paul Craig. So Caio Borralho, Nassourdine Imavov for the featured fight of this card, #1 contender fight. Winner fights the winner of Chimaev and Dricus du Plessis. I think makes all the sense in the world, unless Imavov wants to wait out and fight the winner, but I doubt he wants to do that. I think this makes a lot of sense. Caio Borralho, Nassourdine Imavov. It would be good to see this in like a fight night main event where it's 5 rounds. I know there's been a few people who said that #1 contender fight should be 5 rounds, but I think in this instance, just a quick 3-rounder, put them against each other to solidify #1 contender. Winner will face Chimaev or Dricus du Plessis, depending on who wins that fight. Next one I laugh on this card is going to be Paulo Costa against Roman Kopylov. What a fight this would be. Paulo Costa versus Kopylov. Costa had a very active start to 2024 with 2 fights in like a couple of months and then just dipped from the sport again. And Kopylov's been on an absolute roll. I know he lost to Hernandez, but since then he put together a 2-fight winning streak and he just battered Chris Curtis. I think this would be an amazing fight. Roman Kopylov, he's in the top 15 of the middleweight division. He's probably one of the best strikers in the middleweight division right now. He does lack the grappling and his stamina is quite questionable, but his striking overall is just so fun to watch. And then obviously Paulo Costa used to be a champion contender, massively fallen off, but he's still in the rankings, he's still there, he's a big personality, and again, you've got to have Paulo Costa in Brazil. When was the last time Costa fought in Brazil as well? It's been a while, so let Costa fight in Brazil against Roman Kopylov. Again, this Russia versus Brazil rivalry, but I think even if you take away the countries, this fight just makes a lot of sense. Costa fighting down, fighting an up-and-comer, because all he's been doing is fighting against top contenders and losing. Roman Kopylov getting a chance to fight a higher-ranked guy, a guy who used to be a top contender. Costa, Roman Kopylov for the 4th fight down on this Brazil UFC pay-per-view, I think would make the more sense. And then the main card opener of this card is going to be Gregory Rodriguez versus Nursultan Ruziboyev. A match made this fight after both their recent fights, and this would just be such a banger of a fight. Ruziboyev versus Gregory Rodriguez in the middleweight division would be guaranteed fireworks, because you know what you're getting. You've got Gregory Rodriguez, who just lost to Jared Cannonier in a 5-round fight night main event in a massive step up in competition, but he's an absolute machine, hits like an absolute truck, nearly knocked out Jared Cannonier in that fight, and he's just a machine in the middleweight division. Great grappling as well against Ruziboyev, who's a tall, lanky middleweight as well, very big for the division and has knockout ability. Just knocked out Eric McConaughey, has some of the heaviest hands in the middleweight division, tall, rangy guy who can't really grapple, but I don't think there'd be much grappling in this fight. This would be one of those fights where there's almost a guaranteed bonus on the line. If you're putting Gregory Rodriguez and Nursultan Ruziboyev against each other, 100% there's a bonus on it. Get Gregory Rodriguez in Brazil, opening up a main card against Nursultan Ruziboyev, step up for Ruziboyev Ruzibayev stepped down for Rodriguez after he just lost to Jared Cannonier, but we're still putting it on my pay-per-view main card. I think this would be such a good fight. It makes a lot of sense. Ruzibayev, Rodriguez, two guys who could probably make light heavyweight if we're being honest. These guys are huge for the middleweight division, like I said before. Either way, Rodriguez, Ruzibayev to open up the main card with a bang, because the UFC like opening up main cards with a bang, so this will be an example of that. And then for some prelims, I think Rafael dos Anjos versus Muslim Salikov could be a fight that makes a lot of sense. Two kind of veterans, two old guys. Muslim Salikov's in his 40s. Rafael dos Anjos is one of the oldest lightweights on the roster, or one of the oldest welterweights on the roster right now. Two veterans going at it, and I think it makes a lot of sense. A step up for Salikov, a step down for dos Anjos, because all dos Anjos is facing is veterans, but I think it makes sense. Dos Anjos has been fighting nothing but top contenders for a long time now. He's been fighting nothing but ranked guys in the lightweight and the welterweight division, so I think we give him a bit of a step down in competition against Muslim Salikov, but Muslim Salikov ain't no easy fight. He just had an amazing spinning wheel kick KO of a Son Kanan. He's a really good kickboxer for a 40-year-old guy as well. Again, we're going with this Brazil versus Russia kind of rivalry thing that we put together. Muslim Salikov, Rafael dos Anjos, I think will be an amazing fight. And if Muslim Salikov can beat dos Anjos, we might have to be talking about Muslim Salikov potentially getting somebody in the top 15. He's a really good kickboxer, one of the best spinning wheel kicks in the UFC right now. And obviously dos Anjos is a veteran, a gritty veteran who's coming off a loss to Jeff Neal, but Jeff Neal's one of the most dangerous boxers in the top 15 of the welterweight division. Dos Anjos, Neal, dos Anjos, Salikov, prelim headline. And then I would do Cesar Almeida versus Chris Curtis. Oh man, this is another one of those fights that would just be a banger. They both competed on the first card of this year. Chris Curtis got slaughtered by Kopylov. Cesar Almeida got a brutal KO of the year contender against Abdul Razak Al Hassan. But what a fight this would be. You've got Cesar Almeida, who came from Glory Kickboxing, actually has a win over Alex Pereira, but now he trains with Pereira, which is might kind of make sense for him to be on the same card. Amazing kickboxer, very heavy hands, and like I said, just got a KO of the year contender where he absolutely brutally slept Abdul Razak Al Hassan, taking on Chris Curtis, who is definitely fallen off in his career. He used to be ranked, but he's still an amazing boxer, still defensively very sound, was landing clean on Roman Kopylov. Amazing takedown offense, not that that's going to matter in this fight, but either way, two really good strikers, one of the best boxers, maybe not one of the best, but an amazing boxer in Chris Curtis, who's got pop in his hands. Cesar Almeida, who's a dangerous former Glory kickboxer. Another one of these fights to put Cesar Almeida in Brazil that is just a guaranteed banger. So I'd do that fight too. I'd also do Gabriel Santos versus Sadiq Youssef. If you don't know who Gabriel Santos is, he's lost two fights in the UFC to Lerone Murphy, but it was a very, very close fight to Lerone Murphy on short notice. And he lost to David Onamaru. He was doing really well against Onamaru. And he's coming off a really good win over Jack Jenkins. I think he's now 3-2 in the UFC. He just brutalized Jack Jenkins. I honestly think Gabriel Santos, from the talent that he's shown, is about a fight away from being ranked. Get him in Brazil against Sadiq Youssef, who was once a big prospect in this division, has been out for so long now. His last fight, I think, was at UFC 300, where he lost to a different Brazilian in Diego Lopez. It is a step down in competition for Sadiq Youssef, but it ain't no easy fight. Santos, Youssef on the prelims. And I'd also do Myron Santos versus Jack Jenkins. Now, Myron Santos just competed at UFC 313. He got a win over what was his name? Francis Marshall, but it was quite a controversial win. So I think we give him Jack Jenkins next, who, like I just said, got destroyed by Gabriel Santos, was once a bit of a prospect in the featherweight division. So I would do Myron Santos versus Jack Jenkins. I think it could be a good little scrap. You've got the marauder kind of style of Jack Jenkins, the technical striking style of Myron Santos. Let's get the fight done. And then a couple of early prelims I would do could be Felipe Douglas versus Austin Hubbard. If you don't know who Felipe Douglas is, he's a fighting nerd. So we need to get some more fighting nerds in the UFC. And what better card to do that on than a Brazilian pay-per-view to get Felipe Douglas, the 5th fighting nerd in the UFC, against Austin Hubbard, who's a bit of a journeyman these days. Bruna Brazil, another fighting nerd. She's not really one of the better fighting nerds. She kind of goes under the radar because she's not the best. Against Ming Shi, who got one of the best knockouts, or one of the most brutal knockouts we've seen in women MMA, where she got a head kick KO at UFC Macau and brutalized her opponent. Her versus Bruna Brazil would be an amazing fight. And now we'll do Cumelo Tony. I'm pretty sure he's another fighting nerd as well. So we're getting a third fighting. I don't know if he's a fighting nerd. He might not be. He might just be a Brazilian prospect. But either way, we're getting some guy who's from Brazil on the card against Gilbert Urbina. Those will be the early prelims I'll do for this card. And then for the Abu Dhabi pay-per-view card builder, same main event, Magomed Ankalaev defending his belt against Alex Pereira, which I think makes sense to do this in Abu Dhabi. Ankalaev won the fight, he's the champion, let him defend in front of Abu Dhabi, but I do think Porton should get the rematch. The co-main event, considering this is going to be later on in this year because the Abu Dhabi event's usually around October, maybe they could kind of put him a month back in September, but we'll have to see. The co-main event, Movsar Evloev gets his title fight against Alexander Volkanovski and Diego Lopez. Now, obviously, we've got Diego Lopez and Volkanovski taking each other on for the belt, but Movsar Evloev is probably the more deserving #1 contender. I get why they're doing Diego Lopez. I actually am a fan of Lopez getting a shot, but Evloev's undefeated. He's beaten Diego Lopez. He's got, I think, 4 ranked wins right now. Him getting a title shot in Abu Dhabi in front of his home crowd would make a lot of sense. Against either Diego Lopez or Alexander Volkanovski, I don't think he should have to get another fight before a title shot. He's beat Sterling, Ige, Allen, Lopez, who's now going to be getting a title shot. So if Lopez is the champion, we've got to run the fight back again. Brazil versus Russia kind of rivalry. And even if Volkanovski becomes a champion, who else does he fight? It's got to be Movsar Evloev. So give Evloev his shot. I know it's kind of unfair to, to Volkanovski and Lopez for them to defend the belt in Abu Dhabi against Movsar Evloev because they're the champion. But either way, I think if we're trying to stack a card, that would make sense. But the featured fight I would do is the return of one of Dagestan's best fighters right now, Umar Nurmagomedov. Just lost in a title fight against Murad, but still put up a competitive fight. I would do him versus Song Yadong. I think this fight makes a lot of sense right now because everybody's booked in the bantamweight division. You've got Figueiredo versus Sandhagen. You've got, well, you haven't got Pitiano or O'Malley booked, but they're likely to fight each other or one of them's going to get a title shot. So for Umar, I think him versus Song Yadong makes sense. Yadong just got a win. I know it was controversial, but he's coming off a good win over Henry Cejudo. Umar's only got 1 ranked win in the bantamweight division, and it's Corey Sandhagen. Even though this might seem like a bit of a step down, he is coming off a loss, and I think it's just an opportunity to give Umar Nurmagomedov another guy who's coming off a win in the bantamweight division, another top 7 guy in this division. A tough fight as well because, Song Yadong's takedown defense ain't too bad and he's got pop in his hands. So if Umar can beat Song Yadong in front of Abu Dhabi, that's a big win in front of Abu Dhabi. He's beaten another contender. He's beaten another ranked opponent. And there we can talk about maybe Umar facing a top contender before he gets a title fight. And for Song Yadong, I mean, what bigger win could you have? This would be the biggest win of his career if he can beat Umar Nurmagomedov because he's probably going to be fighting for the belt next if he does do that. And I think, yeah, Song Yadong, Umar Nurmagomedov, Umar coming off a loss, Song Yadong coming off a win. Let's book the fight. I know we want to see Umar versus Figgy, but Figgy's booked, Sandhagen's booked. To get Umar in Abu Dhabi, this would make a lot of sense. 4th fight down, I would do Sergey Pavlovich versus the winner of Marcin Tybura and Mick Parkin. Now, Marcin Tybura and Mick Parkin are going to be taking each other on this weekend, actually, at UFC London. And whoever wins that fight, in my opinion, should take on one of the biggest former prospects in the heavyweight division, Sergey Pavlovich. Now, Pavlovich is coming off an underwhelming win over Rosenstrike, a win that was that, underwhelming that Rosenstrike got cut from the UFC. He's coming off a win, but there wasn't really much hype around it. He couldn't get his hands going. He was very hesitant, and he seems to be very hesitant since the Tom Aspinall fight. And I don't think there's any bigger matchups for Pavlovich right now. Cyril Gane doesn't really make any sense. Jelton Almeida doesn't make any sense. He's obviously lost to Volkov and Aspinall. So I think the winner of Marcin Tybura and Mick Parkin should get a crack at the top 5, and Sergey Pavlovich could be that guy. If Pavlovich can go out there and beat Marcin Tybura or beat Mick Parkin, that's 2 wins in a row for Pavlovich, and in the heavyweight division, that's probably 1 fight away from a title fight. Give him somebody ranked above him, and obviously if Tybura or Parkin can beat Pavlovich, well, you've just beaten one of the best, or one of the scariest, should I say, heavyweights in the division. You're in the top 5. You're doing big things for your career. So I think the winner of Tybura and Parkin should get a step up and face Pavlovich in Abu Dhabi. And I think that would be an amazing fight where Pavlovich would probably get a 1st round finish, but you never know. If he couldn't finish Rosenstrike, what's to say gritty veteran in Marcin Tybura couldn't beat him? Anyway, the main card opener, I would do Sharon Magomedov versus Bruno Ferreira, Brazil versus Abu Dhabi, or Russia, should I say again. I match made this fight after UFC 313. Bruno Ferreira just came off an amazing knockout. I think this is probably one of the best fights you can do right now in the middleweight division. Sharon Magomedov is this crafty kickboxer who's got amazing kicks, got a KO of the year contender last year, who's coming off a loss to MVP. There's no shame in that though. And he's just one of the best kickboxers to watch. He's never been in a boring fight in the UFC, and it's usually him piecing these contenders up against Bruno Ferreira, who might not be as technical, but he's one of the hardest hitting, strongest, and explosive middleweights on the roster right now. Has KO ability, knocked out Gregory Rodriguez before. He's coming off a good win over Armen Petrosian. Brazil versus Russia. To do this fight, I think will be an absolute banger. It's a step down for Sharon Magomedov, away from the top 15, away from the rankings. It's the step up from Bruno Ferreira. I know we lost to Abbas Magomedov last time he fought in Abu Dhabi, but now he's coming off a win, giving him Sharon Magomedov before the rankings. I think will be an amazing fight. There's no way this fight goes the distance, and if it does go the distance, you already know it's going to be one of those bloody back and forth scraps. Powerful, explosive boxer in Bruno Ferreira, technical, crafty, and effective kickboxer in Sharon Magomedov. To open up the main card in Abu Dhabi, I don't think there's any better fights you can make for both of these guys as of right now. Then the prelim headliner, I would do Azamat Murzakanov against the winner of Ian Cutelaba and Modestas Bukauskas. Yeah, Azamat Murzakanov has popped for steroids, so he's going to be out for quite some time. I think he might actually be booked against Johnny Walker, which makes no sense, but I would have done this fight instead because obviously you've got Cutelaba and Bakauskas that are booked. I think it's for, yeah, UFC 315 in Canada, so maybe I didn't really look at the timing of this, but I mean, if we're doing it in Abu Dhabi later this year, it kind of makes sense. And I think the winner of this fight would have definitely deserved somebody in the top 15. And I know that Mazakanov's coming off a winning streak, he's undefeated, but he popped for steroids, he's inactive, he's only got, I think, one win in the top 15 right now in the light heavyweight division. I think we punish him for taking steroids and make him fight outside the rankings. Now, we all letting him fight in front of Abu Dhabi, which is his home crowd because he's Russian, and he's probably going to, you know, absolutely slaughter the winner of Cutelaba and Bakauskas, but it's still a step down for Magomed. It's still kind of punishing him for taking steroids, and it's also a big opportunity for Ian Cutelaba and Bakauskas because if they can beat Magomed, they've beaten a big undefeated prospect in light heavyweight division, and they're now in the top 15. So I would do this for the prelim headliner of UFC Abu Dhabi later on this year. Next fight down on the card I would do is Magomed Ankalaev versus Edson Barboza. Yeah, Magomed Ankalaev is one of the more kind of under the radar prospect. I don't really want to call him a prospect because he did get submitted by Felipe Lima last year, but he's managed to put a couple of wins together. Had a good win over Nathaniel Wood. He's, I think, strung together 2 wins in a row now, or maybe 1 win in a row. He just won recently against Conor Offley, and I think he deserves a bit of a step up. Now, I don't think we give him anybody in the top 15, but Edson Barboza, again, this Brazilian guy, to be on this kind of Brazil versus Russia pay-per-view, who's coming off a bad loss and has been taking a lot of bad losses. Step down against Naimov, I think, would make sense. I would also do Farid Basharat against Pedro Munoz. Now, unlike his brother, Farid Basharat has managed to stay undefeated, even though he doesn't look super dominant. I think he's 14-0, maybe, I'm just making that up. He's undefeated, I know that for sure. But he's kind of on a roll right now in the bantamweight division. Pedro Munoz, being the Brazilian himself, he's kind of... He's not the most consistent. He's very tough, he's Pedro Munoz. He's not somebody that you're going to finish. But, you know, he's lost a couple of fights recently. He needs a bit of a step down. Farid Basharat getting a step up in competition against Pedro Munoz, I think, would make some sense. So I would do this fight in Abu Dhabi too. And I would also do Artem Vatikov versus Rodolfo Bolato. Russia versus Brazil. Now, if you don't know who Artem Vatikov is, this guy actually beat Alex Pereira in Glory Kickboxing back in 2012. I think he was the last guy to beat Alex before Alex joined the UFC. And he's just come from on the Contender Series in the light heavyweight division. So he's kind of built a name of being the guy that beat Alex Pereira, and if he can go and beat another tall, kind of scary Brazilian in Rodolfo Bolato in Abu Dhabi, a Russia versus Brazil rivalry, I think would make sense. Bolato's coming off a draw over Jimmy Crute, where he hasn't really put together the wins and put together the performances that we thought he would. I think this is a very favourable matchup for Vakhitov too, to get his feet wet in the UFC in Abu Dhabi. Vakhitov versus Bolato, I would book this fight. And then for some early prelims, the first one I would do is Boris Medvedev versus Tim Means. I've looked at Medvedev's record. He's got an amazing record outside the UFC. I don't know what it is off by heart, but he's pretty much got this, like, I think it's like 21-2 or something like that. I don't know what his record is, but he's got a huge winning streak, hasn't fought in the UFC yet. I think if we're going to give this guy, a chance to fight in the UFC, give him a pay-per-view in Abu Dhabi against Tim Means, who's a bit of an old, washed, bit of a veteran these days, probably got a fight or 2 left in the UFC. Essentially just feed him to Medvedev to give him a chance in the UFC. I would also do Diogo Nurgashev versus Tuco Tacos. Now, Nurgashev just fought last night, actually, and he looked awful against Brenton Ribeiro. Well, he didn't look awful, but he definitely did live up to the hype, and I think he should have to fight Tuco Tacos. Both of these guys are on the lower end of the light heavyweight division, where they're very lucky to still be in the UFC. They're probably a fight away or a loss away from being cut from the UFC. Make them fight for the UFC contract. Tuco Tacos, who I think is, has potential to be a champion one day, against Nurgazai, who had an underwhelming debut. Kazakhstan on the Abu Dhabi pay-per-view makes sense. Him versus Tuco Tacos, book the fight. And then I would also do Nuro Aliev versus Ismail Bonfim. Now, if you don't know who Aliev is, he was once this big lightweight prospect. He took like 2 years off, came back recently and absolutely mauled Joe Solecki in a recent fight night, and he's definitely a prospect to look out for in the lightweight division. Looks exactly like Khabib as well. Ismail Bonfim, a Brazilian versus kind of, and I don't think he's from Russia, I think he's from like Tajikistan, but he's from that kind of region of the world, against Bonfim, who just took a bad loss recently to Sadikov at a UFC fight night recently. He's coming off a loss, is Brazilian, probably an easy fight for, not an easy fight for Aliev, but definitely a step up for Aliev. I would book that fight. But those are fights I would do for Brazil and an Abu Dhabi card build. Let me know your thoughts on this card, or on both of these cards. If they're good cards to make sense for Brazil and Abu Dhabi for Alex Pereira versus Magomed Ankalaev, let me know your thoughts. Thank you for watching.